The podcast begins by discussing Joe Biden's recent public appearances and the growing concerns about his mental fitness for office. On July 4th, Biden gave a speech in the Rose Garden that was described as incoherent and rambling. He struggled to remember basic information and appeared confused at times. Ben Shapiro plays clips of Biden's speech, highlighting moments where he loses his train of thought and makes nonsensical statements. Shapiro argues that Biden's cognitive decline is becoming increasingly apparent and difficult for his administration to hide. He cites recent polls showing that 80% of Americans, including 76% of Democrats, believe Biden is too old to run for re-election. New surveys indicate Trump now has a 6-point lead over Biden nationally, with even wider margins in key swing states. The podcast discusses an upcoming interview Biden is set to do with George Stephanopoulos, framing it as a potentially make-or-break moment for his candidacy. There are reports that the interview may be as short as 15 minutes, which Shapiro sees as further evidence of Biden's limited capacity to engage substantively. The podcast delves into recent media reports and leaks from inside the Biden administration about the president's declining mental state. It cites a New York Times article revealing that Biden told Democratic governors he needs more sleep and to work fewer hours, including curtailing events after 8 p.m. Shapiro mocks this, saying Biden already sleeps most of the day and questioning how he can work negative hours. An article by Olivia Nuzzi in New York Magazine is discussed at length. Nuzzi reports on Biden's deteriorating condition, with sources describing him as often confused and unable to recognize longtime friends. Shapiro criticizes Nuzzi and other journalists for not reporting on these issues sooner, accusing them of covering for Biden until his debate performance made his decline undeniable. Shapiro reads excerpts from Nuzzi's article, describing Biden's appearance as not quite plausible and having an uncanny, waxy quality. He argues this confirms what conservatives have been saying about Biden's mental state for years, while the media largely ignored or downplayed the issue. The podcast covers growing efforts by Democratic donors and party figures to push Biden out of the race. James Carville is reportedly urging major donors to withhold support from candidates who back Biden. Some donors are working to raise $100 million for a PAC that would support an alternative candidate if Biden steps aside. Shapiro reads quotes from prominent Democratic donors expressing their unwillingness to continue supporting Biden's campaign. He suggests the only way to get Biden to step down may be to offer him a lucrative retirement package, like a $100 million presidential library. The podcast discusses attempts by some in the media to keep Biden's candidacy alive, including an Associated Press headline describing him as sharp and focused, but sometimes confused and forgetful. Shapiro mocks this as an absurd attempt to spin Biden's obvious decline. Donald Trump's response to Biden's struggles is covered, including a video of Trump on a golf course calling Biden a broken-down pile of crap and predicting he will quit the race. Shapiro argues that Trump's best strategy is to largely stay quiet and let the Democrats implode on their own. The podcast touches on Trump's July 4th message, which took shots at Kamala Harris and special counsel Jack Smith. Shapiro suggests that Trump being banned from Twitter and relegated to his own social media platform, Truth Social, has actually been beneficial, as it limits the reach of his more controversial statements. The podcast examines recent election results in the UK, where the Labour Party won a landslide victory over the Conservatives. Shapiro argues this shows the danger for the right if they adopt left-wing policies and appear chaotic, while the left manages to present a more moderate image. He draws parallels to the U.S., suggesting that if Democrats ever pivot to a more centrist position, they could pose a serious threat to Republicans. Shapiro speculates that if Kamala Harris replaces Biden as the nominee, she may try to move to the center and make the race more competitive. The podcast concludes by touching on patriotism and political divisions in the U.S. It criticizes left-wing protesters who burned American flags on July 4th, contrasting this with Biden campaign messaging that tries to paint Republicans as extremists who would turn America into a dystopia like The Handmaid's Tale. Shapiro argues that polling data shows conservatives are actually more patriotic and supportive of American ideals than those on the left. He suggests this disconnect between reality and the narratives pushed by Democrats and the media is a key factor in the current political landscape. Throughout the podcast, Shapiro provides sharp criticism and often mocking commentary on Biden, his administration, and the media's coverage. He portrays Biden as barely functional and suggests his team is desperately trying to prop him up and hide his decline from the public. The podcast takes a decidedly conservative perspective, celebrating Biden's struggles and the growing calls for him to step aside. It frames the situation as a vindication of right-wing critiques of Biden that were dismissed or downplayed by the mainstream media for years. At the same time, Shapiro expresses some concern about potential scenarios that could still pose a threat to Republicans in 2024. He warns that if Democrats manage to replace Biden with a more competent candidate who can present a moderate image, it could make the race much more competitive. The podcast also touches on broader themes about the state of American politics and media. It portrays much of the press as complicit in covering up Biden's decline and only now reluctantly reporting on it as it becomes impossible to ignore. Shapiro suggests this has severely damaged media credibility and exposed their bias. There's a recurring focus on the disconnect between the narratives pushed by Democrats and left-leaning media versus the reality perceived by much of the public. Shapiro argues this gap is fueling distrust in institutions and driving political polarization. The discussion of international political trends, particularly in the UK and France, adds a broader context to the analysis of U.S. politics. It suggests that the success of more moderate left-wing parties in Europe could provide a template for Democrats if they're willing to move away from their more progressive wing. Overall, the podcast presents a scathing critique of Biden, his administration, and his supporters in the media and Democratic Party. It portrays the current political moment as a potential inflection point, with Biden's decline creating both opportunities and risks for Republicans heading into 2024. Shapiro's commentary is unabashedly partisan, celebrating conservative victories and mocking liberal failures, while warning his audience to remain vigilant against potential Democratic pivots that could change the political calculus.